Alrighty, Landon. So I got your mechanics week one, what we did last week and this week, just to kind of compare both of them and go into it a little bit more and just kind of see where we're going and what we worked on this week. So I'm gonna play them real quick and then we'll go from there. Okay, so first things first. The main thing we really wanted to focus on in this lesson was your hips, right? So the one thing we talked about last week is really engaging into this back hip, right? And you do a great job here of starting to get yourself into this back hip right now. The one thing that I want to keep working on is that I want to, at the same time, while we're turning this hip, I also want to be going down into the ground, right? Because we talked about last week how you're a driver, right? And the key to being a driver is two things. Number one, we want to take our weight towards the ground. And number two, we want to take the baseball towards the ground, right? So, like we talked about, right, we get to this point, and like we talked about last week, we do start bringing this baseball to the ground, right? The problem that we run into is we get to this point, right, what we did last week, which is instead of just throwing straight down, we throw down and back. And the problem with throwing down and back, right, it's not necessarily a bad thing if you do either of the two. The problem is when you combine both, because that's going to make your arm lag. So if we look in this top one right here, right, I'm just drawing that blue arrow just for your attention. Whenever we get to this point, right, look at what happens to our arm, right? We throw it down and we throw it back. And the problem is we get into this power W, right? Now notice this week versus last week, right? This week, we are more in a flatter position like this versus last week, we were just still in this power W, right? So we're getting better at the part of getting ourselves to come up and using this whip right here, right? You notice, number one, if I were to draw a line right here of your shoulder, week one, your elbow is way below your shoulder, and week two, your elbow is well above your shoulder, which is really good, and that's a really great adjustment because we want to make sure that we keep as much stress as there is on the elbow during pitching, we want to keep as little stress on it as well. I know that sounds very counterintuitive, but what I'm trying to get at is that we're trying to get to the point where we alleviate some stress from our elbow, right? If we keep it above our shoulder, that alleviates a lot of stress because instead of pushing like we did in week one up above here, where we're pushing through it, week two, we're getting better at this part right here, which is this layback and the flick, right? You do a lot better of a job getting to this position. You do push just a tad still, but we're getting to the point that we're getting to this point right here, and this is where we would then flick over, right? So, great job on that part as well. Now let's get into the lower half here, right? So, you do a lot better of a job this week getting more into an athletic stance right here, and I just want you to kind of take a look at where you are here and where you are here and ask me between both of these which one's more athletic. I'm going with number two, right? Because it just looks like it's a way more athletic position. Now, I would like you to, while you're getting into this back hip right here, I want you to also be making forward progress at the same time. And we could talk about that next pitching lesson, which will be in a little bit. But in the meantime, that's something that I want you to work on is while we are getting into this back hip, right, I want you to also be making that forward progress, right? I don't want us to be at a stopping point right here where, yes, we've loaded up this hip right here, but what momentum do we have to bring ourselves forward, right? And then we have to kind of restart and bring ourselves not only towards home plate, but also kind of rebuild in this back hip, right? So that's one thing to keep working on. We'll keep working on as we go forward. Then we get to this point here. Notice you do a lot better of a job this week right here getting into a really great block position, right? This time around, we have our arm at this 45-degree angle on both sides, which is where we want to be at, versus if we look at block angle on the other one, your arm is still trying to catch up here, right? So you did a really great job of working this week to get your arm, number one, on time, but number two, getting it to the point that we can go into our layback phase of right here and creating more whip action. Now, the one thing that I really kind of emphasized at the end of the lesson that I want you to keep working on is this finish, right? So instead, when we get to this point right here, we should be starting to straightening up our leg, right? We should get to a point that we start from here where we have a little bit, realistically, it should be right here where we land, right? We shouldn't continue to collapse on this knee, right? Versus instead, we land right here, and then we work on straightening it into this line, which is going to help us, number one, finish chest down, but number two, it's also going to help us to bring this leg up and over ourselves, right? Instead of having to go over and around and almost hinging it, right? Or I guess rather a better term is coming around our hip versus, like we talked about, either supermaning or scorpioning it and coming up and over our front knee here, right? Which is also going to help us with our chest to get down. Because right now, you finish very straight up, right? I realistically want you to be at a point where we're like this when we're finishing. Because that's going to help us, number one, because you're releasing the ball right here, versus if we're more straight out, you're probably going to be releasing this ball more so like right out here. And that goes back into perpetual velocity, which we kind of touched on in the very first lesson. And perpetual velocity, to go more into it, is basically the perception of velocity to the batter, right? So, for example, as a taller athlete as yourself and with a longer wingspan, you're going to get more perpetual velocity because the ball is going to be further out, right? So a shorter guy, they're going to release this ball right here versus you are going to be releasing it way out here. Because of the fact that you're taller, you have a longer wingspan, you're going to be able to get out further, which is going to create the ball to be closer to home plate, which is going to give a lesser reaction time for hitters in order to hit it. So that's a little lesson there on perpetual velocity. Other than those things, we'll keep working on it. You did a great job again this week of kind of just adjusting and working with me. So great job, number one, being coachable. But number two, way to get after it this week.